Recently, I ran into one of those tedious coaches that insisted the way they did things was the only correct way to do things. I would mention I was taught to do it this way by this legendary champion, or this legendary coach. And his response is that they must have gotten lucky. So turning an infuriating situation into a positive, here's 50 different ways to throw a jab. I also give an example of a specific fighter that used it. Mostly boxers because they're the best at the jab, but also kickboxers, Thai fighters, and mixed martial artists too. A lot of these can be combined with each other, and you might call these techniques something different. So I'm looking forward to discussing in the comments section. Let's get started. Number 1. Vertical fist jab. Espoused by the great Jack Dempsey, and used extensively by Manny Pacquiao. It's great for splitting the guard. Horizontal fist, the most common way. It aligns the biggest two knuckles to hit, and if done correctly, there's a last-second twist that can cause further damage. We'll go with De La Hoya here, because he had a really nice jab. Number 3. Stiff jab, where the jab is kept rigid and tight and the whole body tenses on impact. Used by Sonny Liston to decimate opponents with his freakishly large hands, as wide around as most men's biceps. Power jab, like a stiff jab but with a lot more weight and commitment behind it. Recently used by Triple G and Oscar Valdez. Loose jab, or throwaway jab, thrown to irritate and bother opponents in order to set up harder shots, used by the likes of Alexander Usyk. Flicker jab, used by Thomas Hearns and Muhammad Ali, who compared his jab to swatting at a fly or the crack of a whip. This jab starts loose, but still hits hard. In comparison to a throwaway jab, it has a lot more impact, a lot more angles, and can cause a lot of swelling as the fight goes on. Straight jab, thrown from the shoulder or chin. The go-to standard with a clear straight path right to your target. Triple G makes for a great example. Body jab, almost always done with the level change so as not to punch down, but some Thai fighters will punch down to avoid head movement. Floyd Mayweather was a master of this jab, even knocking an opponent down with it. Rising jab, thrown from below, with the hand resting well below the shoulder or even from below the hip. Used by Mayweather and James Toney as it pairs well with the Philly shell, and by the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson. Robinson had a lot of jabs, and he should be the first fighter that everyone looks at if they want to better understand the jab. Down jab, aiming down at your opponent from a high position, usually thrown from a high guard or high long guard, used by Terrence Crawford to paw over the opponent's guard. It's also a useful punch for tracking the opponent's head movement. Corkscrew jab, the fist flips over and turns down at the end to curve around the shoulder. Great for southpaws and those fighting them. Winky Wright had this jab as one of many in his incredible jab arsenal. Next up, half jab or short jab, thrown with the arm already halfway extended. Leaves the boxer more open to attacks, but the jab gets there quicker and can lend itself to long guard tactics. Used by the likes of Marquez, Gomez, Lennox Lewis, and many others. Great for boxer punchers with a long reach. Back fist jab. Technically illegal in boxing, but also kind of not if it connects with the front of the two knuckles, or at least close to it. Used by Thomas the Hitman Hearns, Nassim Hamed, and many others. Pawing jab, used by Foreman, Liston, the man who taught it to him, and Joe Louis. This jab breaks down upon contact, leaving you more open after throwing, as Max Schmeling demonstrated with his win against Lewis. But the upside is that it covers extra surface area and occasionally pulls down the opponent's gloves, clearing way for the next shot. Feint jab. Just feinting a jab. Pretty self-explanatory and used by every fighter in the history of ever. You just pretend you're throwing a jab to set up another punch. Could even be another real jab. Moving into the realm of, are these actually jabs now? Hook jab, or a straight-armed hook. In between a jab and a hook, the arm is straight and then loops and angles around, but can hit from the front. Used by Lennox Lewis and Tyson Fury, amongst others. Hammer jab, used by Gene Fulmer and thrown from his strange reverse crossguard position. As odd as his style was, it worked to defeat the best boxer the world had ever seen, Sugar Ray Robinson. Next we have the upper jab, thrown with the palm up like an uppercut. Halfway between a straight and an uppercut. It's been used by McGregor and Prince Nassim. Circling jab, or fencer jab, used extensively by Lomachenko. It can begin as a circle to disguise and distract, or circle around their guard or jab to connect as more of a corkscrew. Also great for clearing away attacks off of the original jab. You can even set up catches off of it. Number 20. Leg jab. I think Yoel Romero just threw this to be funny, but he's made out of adamantium, so who knows? Maybe it was to dull reactions for takedowns or something. Now on to footwork. Stationary jab. Thrown in place without moving your feet. Thrown by everyone goes without saying, but had to say it. Stepping jab. Taking a small step to gain some distance. Now on to something fun. Drop step jab. Thrown by Jack Dempsey. Your weight is moved forward, and your foot is lifted at the last moment to fall into your punch. Look at it like you're tripping, and then catch yourself with your fist on the opponent's face. A similar idea in principle is to throw a jab off of a kick or check. Pivot jab, used to change angles to circle while jabbing. Great for exiting. Jersey Joe Walcott had some great examples, and his footwork in general was incredible. Shuffle or leaping jab, or gazelle jab if you like. Used by marvelous Marvin Hagler. He could catch you halfway across the ring with it. Once he got a hold of you, it was hard to escape. Skip jab, used by the greatest, Muhammad Ali. The hop gave him extra mobility and reach. A lot of risk involved, but great if you could make it pay off. This footwork doesn't just throw out the rulebook, it takes it out back and beats it until it knows not to show its face around the place anymore. Cross-step jab. Speaking of, Ali would also cross-step on his jab, with and without hopping. He was inspired to do this by watching his idol, Sugar Ray Robinson, who would use it to glide across the ring. Probably he got this technique from his love of dancing. Blitz jab or jump jab, again by Ali, who would also hop off both feet while throwing. So rare, I've only ever seen it with Ali, and in martial arts point tournaments to score a quick point with no power behind it. Wait a minute, the video's almost done, and I realize Walcott did it too. Ghost step jab. The foot looks like it's going to set down, but then the fighter explodes forward at the last second. Used by the great Ricardo Lopez. And here by Leonard to land a knockdown. Sneak step jab. Used by Lomachenko and many more. The jab disguises the back foot sneaking either forward or backwards, setting up a harder punch. Deep inside step jab. Opens you up to the opponent's cross, but creates a nice angle to land your jab while circling. Used extensively by pressure fighters like Tyson. Deep outside step jab. Used by southpaws and those fighting them. Denies the opponents an angle to hit you from their rear side attacks, while lining up your own attack. Here's Lomachenko doing it. Shift through jab. Moving into southpaw or neutral stance while jabbing to add some extra distance, power, and angles. Used by Wonderboy Thompson to change angles and line up his high kick. Shift back jab. Used here by Mike Tyson against Razor Ruddock. Switch jab. Instead of shifting by stepping forward, both feet switch. Used by Dominic Cruz as part of his brilliant, elusive, and tricky style. Superman jab. Thrown by the living legend, GSP. He would even chain it into a roundhouse. Split step jab. Used by Ricardo Lopez and Salvador Sanchez. The move quickly transitions the fighter from a short, more mobile boxing stance into a deeper power stance, great for punching hard or wrestling. Most of the examples I have in my video are of power punches, but trust me, this works for the jab too. Now on to head movement, starting with the ducking jab. Pretty self-explanatory. Done by everyone, but Chavez was pretty good at it, so I'll use him as an example. Slip outside jab. Tyson was great at this one, combining it with the rising jab to close distance. When people say the term up jab, they usually mean this outside slip with the jab going up, but not always. Slip inside jab requires insane balance and is very hard to do since you have little base of support, but Sugar Ray Leonard could pull it off consistently. Blends well with the cross step. Pullback jab, used by Gomez and Rocky Marciano. The jab is more to fend off attacks while closing distance. The power of the punch is sacrificed to keep the weight back so that the follow-up attack, where the weight is moved forward, is more powerful. Number 42. Jamming jab. The jab is used more to block and jam punches than to land. Used a lot by Cotto against southpaws, basically as a way to brute force hand fighting. Long block jab. The jab is used to block follow-up attacks. Used by George Foreman and the legendary sky-piercing knee, Dieselnoy. Trap jab, pulling down the opponent's guard to trap them off of your jab. Used by a lot of MMA greats, but also Deontay Wilder. In fact, this advanced tactic was responsible for the majority of his knockouts. Frame jab, leaving the jab out to turn or lean on the opponent's head or shoulder. This was Sonny Liston's forte. In fact, he did this with pretty much all of his punches, leaning his weight on his competitors to set them up for the next shot. Smother jab. The jab is left out to clamp the opponent's guard to their face so they can't follow up with a shot. Lomachenko, Foreman, and Joe Louis are prime examples. Cross smother jab, used by southpaws to position the arm across the opponent's guard to block their vision and smother their attack with their forearm. Here's Pacquiao doing it. Push jab can be done to the chest or shoulder to turn the opponent. Hearns used this setup to land a beautiful knockdown against Leonard. Pull jab. The opponent slips and the jab is turned into a collar tie. This can be great for setting up uppercuts, but it was also used by Muhammad Ali to slow down the action. Lingering jab. A jab that stays in front for a moment, used to block the opponent's vision for follow-up attacks. I'm sure at this point you can recognize the boxers from the previous examples. Now for some extra credit. On to the miscellaneous, fantastical, and downright illegal. Eye jab, used by John Jones. Heartbreak jab. While a lot of moves from the popular boxing anime Hajime no Ippo are greatly exaggerated, but overall based in real techniques, this is not one of them. However, it used to be common for boxers to jab to the heart on purpose because they believed it would weaken their opponent. This was probably accidentally true because it's body work after all. Lastly, the shadow jab, used by Rigondeaux. Rigondeaux would shadow box in the ring, showing the exact punch he was about to knock his opponent out with in slow motion, and then hitting exactly where they would be in just a moment. This seems like a magic trick until you realize he was just baiting opponents to counter those specific punches. It was basically a dare they took him up on and lost. It would be fun to see in an anime though.
Lennox Lewis was the last undisputed heavyweight champion in history, and it's easy to see why. Lewis soundly defeated the best of his era, garnering an impressive resume to go along with his insane highlight reel. Lewis was a boxer-puncher who fought on the outside until he was ready to take his opponent out. And while Lewis possessed incredible finesse, using his lead hand with the skill of a fencer using his sword, he also always went for the finishing shot. And Lewis set up these shots with one of the best jabs ever seen in the ring. Lewis's jab was certainly powerful, but his true power lied in his insane versatility. Lewis had a jab for every occasion. He was able to exploit the specific weaknesses in any opponent's chosen system of defense. Lewis's rising jab came up from his hip, like Ali's. But unlike Ali's whipping jab, Lewis's version was stiff. This meant that he could drive his jab through the crack in his opponent's guard like an uppercut, but obviously with much greater range. As such, this jab was ideal for stopping fighters who liked to move in with low-line head movement. They were essentially ducking directly into Lewis's jab, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. Lewis also hurled out his lead like a back fist, targeting his opponent's lead eye from the side. And this was particularly useful for hiding Lewis's follow-up right. Many competitors never knew what hit them until it was too late. Like Foreman, Lewis also had a swatting jab. This jab came over the top, clearing his opponent's guard out of the way. And finally, Lewis had a looping lead, something between a jab and a hook. Lewis would wind this punch around his opponent's guard, starting it from the hip and keeping his arm entirely straight throughout the duration of the punch. All Lewis needed to do was tap an opponent to prompt him to widen his guard, clearing a path down the middle. These 4 jabs that came from 4 different directions, as well as conventional head and body jabs that traveled straight down the middle, allowed Lewis to attack from any direction at any time. More importantly, Lewis was able to use one jab to set up others, as well as knock out power punches. Notice how Lewis's rising jab often prompted his opponents to try and catch it like an uppercut, clearing a path over the top. With the opponent's right hand being used to defend, Lewis could change the direction of his jab mid-punch to circle around into a looping jab. Of course, you could call it a stiff-armed hook if you prefer. What's important is the concept. Lewis loved to change one punch into another midway through, using directional feints. Similar to how Canelo changes the direction of his hook midway to its target, Lewis could turn a punch that began as a jab into a hook, often following up with a right. Another common tactic of Lewis's was to keep his jab half extended, never retracting it fully so that he could rapid-fire leads from all different directions. Notice how Lewis uses straights, looping jabs, and back fists to attack all sides of his opponent's guard. This worked very well to shut down head movement as well, as it's much harder to dodge punches from multiple different directions. But something that Lewis could use on all of his jabs were pauses. One of the earlier videos on this channel covered how Lomachenko blocked his opponent's vision so they didn't notice he'd changed angles. They remained entirely in the dark about Lomachenko's new position. Lewis used this same principle in a much more subtle way, blocking opponent's vision or pinning their guard so that he had time to load up on huge power shots. And because his jabs came from so many different angles, Lewis could set up a variety of different punches that worked best for each situation. Lewis sometimes took this one step further by using his jab to frame or pull an opponent into the path of his punches. Of course, if he couldn't find an opening, he could simply create one by using his extended jab to pry open or pull down an opponent's guard. This is an extremely advanced tactic that Lewis pulled off flawlessly multiple times. Lewis's versatile jab illustrates a powerful concept. As a wise man once said, "When one has no form, one can be all forms. When one has no style, he could fit with any style." By tailoring his jab to fit every situation and putting in the time to learn each variation to perfection, Lewis was able to take one of the most simplistic tools in boxing and use it to dominate an era.
Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Today, we're going to be looking at the second part. Longtime viewers know that we've covered Ali's footwork and head movement in great detail.
Did he have on his dancing shoes? He has.
It's interesting, creative, and inventive, and often veers into the unexpected. And it defies convention. Far different from any other martial artist who's ever competed in combat sports. However, the greatest had even more up his sleeve than slick defensive styling. His punches were just as unusual as they were impactful. And they could still catch keen-eyed observers by surprise today. So let's take a look at how Muhammad Ali broke all the rules to establish a style that still hasn't been rivaled half a century later. It's hard to tell at full speed, but Ali's punches were so unorthodox that many of them look more similar to strikes thrown in traditional martial arts, like karate or kung fu. And I'm not saying this to try and justify my time as a kid getting 2 black belts, or to suggest that boxers should take inspiration from karatekas. I'm saying the opposite. In this sport of boxing, generations of elite fighters have figured out what works best. But just like the rest of his style, Ali made the things usually seen as bad habits that can get you knocked out work in his favor. When it comes to Ali's punches, there's no better place to start than the jab. Most coaches would tell you to snap the jab straight from the shoulder while staying within a sure-footed, sturdy base. This works for most fighters. Ali wasn't most fighters. And his jab exemplifies many of the attributes that made him so exceptional. To start, he threw it from all angles. Sometimes like a straighter hook, sometimes like a back fist, sometimes rising up, and sometimes right down the middle. He often led with the elbow, which meant his jab could lash out like a whip. He would lift his rear foot far off the canvas. The deep lean forward covered more distance, but more importantly, it offered him much more mobility than a textbook jab. With his foot unpinned, he could cross-step and hop, remaining in a safely narrow posture while covering massive distance. Circling in so deep opened targets to the head and body, and constantly resetting the angle forced his opponents to turn. Ali's opponents had a tough time setting their feet, trying to throw any meaningful offense, and if they tried to throw well off balance, they'd often miss and get countered. Which brings us nicely to the logical follow-up of the jab, and the next unusual strike of Ali's, the cross. Paired with the cross-step jab, Ali's right was a lethal fight ender. Compared to the usual boxing convention, this punch too is a unique beat. Like the jab, most coaches would advise against lifting the back foot too high for the cross. But once again, Ali did it his way. Throwing it after his unusual jab sequence, Ali would sometimes cross-step into his right, strafing his rear leg the opposite way that he was throwing his punch and moving his shoulders. This shouldn't have worked, and probably did because it was so accurate and his opponent was coming in, as seen famously against Sonny Liston. Later on, he would devise an alternate version, blending a shifting lead right into the same footwork pattern. This lacked the same kind of power, but it was pretty surprising. The trajectory of the punch was also a little bit weird, in that Ali liked to loop it first and then straighten it out. But this worked great for looping it over the opponent's jab, or just getting around his lead shoulder. Next, let's look at something no one ever talks about: Ali's wide array of unconventional hooks. First, he was a master of the gazelle hook, a leaping shot that covers distance while cracking an opponent with the left. Done correctly, the momentum of the leap is directed into the target. And, needless to say, Ali did it correctly. While most fighters load up and therefore telegraph the gazelle hook by dipping their lead shoulder before exploding into action, the fleet-footed Ali could bounce into it at a moment's notice. Always crafty, Ali could turn the hook into a collar tie and pull or frame against his opponent. Next, let's take a look at what we'll call his hammer hooks. With the traditional hook, you'd want to connect with the top of the knuckle. Some prefer vertical fist, and some horizontal. Ali often did neither, and would turn his palm towards the sky, connecting with the bottom of his hand like a hammer fist. He would turn his fist over during or after the punch, as he followed through. The end result looking something like a karate chop with boxing gloves. Or sometimes, he'd just connect with the palm. This isn't technically legal under boxing's modern rule set, but it is possible Ali did this to mitigate hand pain, an obstacle he dealt with for years. But that very likely wasn't the only reason, because these techniques proved incredibly useful in close quarters combat. For example, Ali used the hammer hook to chip through small cracks in Frazier's crossguard, something that Frazier made near impossible with conventional hooks. The gazelle, hammer, and palm hooks weren't the only oddball hooks that Ali threw. The last one was a variation of the bolo hook, thrown with either hand. This wind-up hook was sneaky and crushing. He would begin the punch like an uppercut before whirling it around to his target. With his lead hand, this would be a clockwise motion. Since the opponent was expecting an uppercut, they would often dip low and slightly drop their guard. This was perfect for Ali because it opened up the path for his hook. And then there was the reverse. Sometimes Ali would fake a hook by flaring out his arm, and then turn it into an uppercut. With his lead arm, this motion would be counterclockwise. Just like the wind-up hook, Ali's glove would crack through the target like a whip. Ali's speed was already challenging enough for most competitors, but the unusual directions of his strikes made it even harder to tell which punch was coming and where it was coming from. The result was a style that was both beautiful and deadly. Not literally, but I mean, look at that. If you're thinking about using Ali's strikes yourself, you probably shouldn't. Unfortunately, we can't all be the greatest. But that doesn't mean we can't emulate the elements of what made him special. We could find things that work for us that wouldn't work for anybody else, just like Ali did. More than anything, Ali's philosophy represents the idea that conventional wisdom doesn't have to be a limiting factor. A beautiful thing about martial arts is that it could be a method of self-expression just as much as a series of techniques and tactics. While reading the rulebook is important, how you interpret it and making those rules your own is what truly counts towards martial arts mastery. The jab is the most common punch thrown, and for good reason. It can help to control the ring, set up harder punches, keep the opponents at a distance, pile up damage over time, you name it, the jab can do it. The only thing a jab has a difficult time with, a very difficult time with, is knocking the competitor out. That requires power punches. And that's what we'll be covering today, how to counter the jab. Because even if you can't land a counter hard enough to knock your opponent out cold, repeatedly countering their jab can make them hesitant to throw it. And if they're hesitant to throw the jab, then they can't use all those great aspects we talked about against you. So quick note, I'll be showing the southpaw versions of these counters, just assuming that if you're a southpaw, you can reverse what I'm saying in your head and get it to work for you. But I will be mentioning specific counters that work better for southpaws fighting orthodox or vice versa. And if you'd like to learn more about those positions and different rules, you could check out my video on southpaw angles. Let's get to it. The most common power punch to use to counter the jab is the cross. And there are a number of good ways to do this. So if one of these cross counter methods doesn't work for you, don't worry, there's probably one that better suits your style. So, the first cross tactic is the whole reason a cross is called a cross in the first place. You slip your head inside, toward the opponent's rear hand, then cross your arm over their jab to nail them by coming around their shoulder. Joe Louis was exceptional at this. This tactic became so common, all right straights can now be called crosses, the same way it's acceptable to ask for a Kleenex rather than a tissue. You'll want to intercept your opponent's punch here, meaning you throw as soon as you see them throwing and catch them coming in. If you're a southpaw or fighting a southpaw, you can still make this work in what's called a split entry counter. You move your head to the outside and then thread your cross down the middle. This was pretty much Manny Pacquiao's signature move for years. Rather than intercept, you could throw a return counter, meaning you let them jab, then attack and return a punch as they would throw their punch. In this instance, you'll want to slip outside, towards their weak side. And this tilt or turn to your right will help load up your follow-up punch. As well as slip, you can also pull. Muhammad Ali was a total master at this, and Mayweather liked to use it while in a high guard. Parries also work well to clear a pathway, especially while in an opposite stance. The last cross counter is the most unusual, which is to get inside of the opponent's jab, usually by stepping far left. This tactic works much better to counter the opponent's lead hook, since you have a wider area to attack and more time to throw. But it can be used against jabs if you're really quick and have your competitor's timing completely down. A close cousin to the cross is the overhand. And if you could land that as a counter, then your opponent will probably have some difficulty remaining on their feet. The overhand can go over the opponent's shoulder, inside their jab, or pretty much any direction you like. But it's very telegraphic and requires exceptional speed and athleticism to pull off. Think Roy Jones Jr. or Canelo-level explosiveness. The next way to counter the jab is the lead hook. But unless your opponent has some really sloppy defense and slow footwork, this may require some setup. Most opponents will be pivoting away from your hook with their rear hand protecting their head as they jab. So you might want to aim for their body with a hook a few times first to get them to lower their guarding hand. Or you can use a raking downward hook that can go over or in between their guard. Or lastly, you can try what Frazier repeatedly used against Ali and slip outside to counter the jab with a hook. This requires either Frazier's head movement and timing, or an exceptional reach advantage. One last point on the hook. If you throw it hard enough times, then it won't matter if your opponent has their guard up or not. Too many times I've seen amateurs forget that you don't always need an opening in the opponent's defense to throw something. Sometimes you could just batter at their guard until you start to blast through it. So what about rear hooks? Well, we'll say that we covered that in the overhand section. But the jab does leave your opponent very open to body hooks, and for that matter, body crosses. Like the overhands though, it may be hard to counter a jab, the most high-tempo punch, with a much slower tempo, high-commitment punch. It's usually better to use your right body hook against the jab as a southpaw because the shorter distance of the target makes it easier. The last counter to the jab may surprise you, but if you can pull it off, it's lethal. That's right, the uppercut. And there are two great ways to do it. The first is with your lead hand, and this is specific to the opponent ducking forward into their jab. You can meet them with your left as they come up. The second way is far more difficult, and that's to use your rear hand, or if you're a southpaw, your lead hand, to cross underneath in the complete reverse of the cross method. While these are all great counters that can end the fight, never forget that the bread and butter counter to the opponent's jab is your own jab. He who controls the left can control the world.
Vasili Lomachenko is perhaps the greatest fighter of our generation, and one of his most impressive attributes is his ability to use unorthodox techniques to confuse and dominate his opponents. We've already looked at how Lomachenko targets his opponent's vision, covering the slot in their guard to keep them in the dark, and leaving his rear hand behind to trick his competitors into thinking he's still there. This time, we'll take a look at another of Lomachenko's unusual but highly effective techniques. Rather than retract his jab, Lomachenko will keep his arm extended to circle and parry, much like a fencer redirecting an opponent's blade. He can then take advantage of the openings he's just created. This technique essentially works as a multi-purpose defensive movement. By using this straight arm parry off of his jab, Lomachenko can set up a variety of attacks and guard manipulations. In this clip, Lomachenko jabs, but instead of retracting his punch, he keeps his arm straight and uses it to deflect his opponent's counter cross. In this way, Lomachenko can immediately negate his opponent's counters. If his competitor ducks inside, Lomachenko will again keep his arm extended in circles, but this time, he can either swipe his glove in front of his competitor's eyes to block their vision, or pull down one of their hands. Yet another variation is to frame off of their head or shoulders. Lomachenko uses the stiff-armed parry as an all-purpose technique when disengaging, allowing him to deal with nearly any incoming attacks and giving him valuable time to assess the situation and find openings or weaknesses. But Lomachenko will often perform the exact opposite technique as well. Rather than keep his arm straight to manipulate his opponent's guard, Lomachenko will keep his hand stuck to his competitor to close distance. To do this, he'll either pull his opponent's guard down, creating an opening, or bend his own arm as he moves inside, framing off of his opponent to offset their balance or pin their arm. Mixing these techniques together makes for one of the most confusing skill sets to deal with in boxing, and is one of the many reasons that Lomachenko always seems to be one step ahead of his opponents,
And this is just a few examples of the incredible variety of skillful techniques Lomachenko can manage off of his jab alone. He can use it to deflect, pin, pull, block his opponent's vision, and of course, punch them in the face. If you're like me, you can't wait to see how far Lomachenko will go, or what new techniques from the Matrix Vasili Lomachenko has in store for us. Every time Miguel Cotto fought, there was a 100% guarantee that win or lose, you were in for a fantastic bout. And that's because the Puerto Rican champion was a unique combination of styles. A hybrid boxer that took the most technical and elegant elements of sport and paired them with the most primal and aggressive. That's rare, and a big reason that he was able to do this was because he was a natural southpaw, being left-handed. However, he chose to fight from an orthodox stance with his left side forward, meaning that he enjoyed a whole lot of power in his lead hand. And I would argue this aided him tremendously in getting away with a pretty rare and unusual combination of styles. You've likely all heard of boxer punchers. Boxers who have a great jab and footwork, but rather than stay outside and outpoint their opponent the whole match, they use their boxing to set up harder punches. Thomas the Hitman Hearns is a prime example. He started off as a fleet-footed outboxer, but as he put on more and more muscle, he found that his boxing could set up insanely powerful punches, like his signature chopping right. But I would classify Cotto as a boxer swarmer. A swarmer overwhelms their opponent with endless amounts of volume. They can use well-crafted combinations so that one punch sets up the next punch. Or they can say screw all that and just beat on their opponent's guard like a drum, striking with an unending crescendo of pure violence reminiscent of Danny Carey. And the merger of these two styles, boxing and swarming, were glued together by Cotto's extra powerful lead hand, because he could make his presence felt while boxing with his jab, and throw crushing lead head hooks and liver shots while swarming, so he could enjoy all of the benefits of high-volume combinations that swarmers do, and not have to deal with the massive cardio requirements and all the wasted shots that normally come with that style. Most importantly, his boxing set up his swarming, helping him to track down and paralyze his opponent so he could unload and finish the job. So let's take a look at his boxing first. As much as Cotto's remembered as an aggressive front foot fighter, he was equally as good on the back foot, seen floating around the ring, working off his jab. While boxing up his opponents, Cotto preferred stepping pretty far to his left. An easy rule to remember is that the further left a boxer steps, the more he opens up both himself and his opponent to attacks. Moving deeper inside lined up Cotto's cross, as well as creating a better angle for his lead hook to circumvent their guard. This meant Cotto was moving towards his opponent's rear hand as well, but his competitors were usually too busy dealing with Cotto's well-set-up attacks to try and counter. Cotto preferred to punctuate his combinations with his killer left hook. He had a lot of variations and setups, often using a cross or a cross feint to get him into position to throw the hook. Cotto could use his jab or his cross to get his opponent to shell up, and then, already moving to his left, he was perfectly lined up to target their side with a body hook. Naturally, stepping to his left worked out well against southpaws, as he was taking the usually dominant outside lead foot position. If you'd like to learn more about southpaw tactics, I have an entire breakdown on all of the positions, which I'll link in the description. When Cotto wanted to get more serious, he would lower his stance and lean in with his head forward. This more committal position didn't let him circle and cut angles as quickly, but with his back heel spring-loaded, he was able to throw with authority while covering a massive distance. He would push off into a solid jab whenever he wanted to quickly close the gap. If opponents punched first, then even better. He was already prepped to launch forward and intercept them as they stepped in. He was particularly good at returning a hook to counter their cross, a boxing classic. Crossing a right over their jab was another favorite. If you can take away a boxer's jab, usually they'll have very little left. As slick a boxer as Cotto could be, he was also great at pressuring and cutting off the ring. This was how he started his boxing career. He knew how to march opponents back towards the ropes, using diagonal footwork to cut off angles. Notice how he stepped sideways to block his opponent's escape route off, whereas if he had moved straight forward, the opponent could have exited out the side. The idea is that whether they try to escape to the right or to the left, they'll be walking into a hard punch, creating a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Cotto first used his jab while closing distance, but once he got close, his competitors risked moving into a lead hook or a rear hand attack, depending which way they tried to flee. He would even occasionally shift into southpaw to gain more distance and block their escape routes, something that really confused his southpaw competitors. This also let him load up his left hand, briefly enjoying the benefits of being a true southpaw. However he got them there. Once Cotto managed to herd an opponent to the ropes, he could swarm like a nest of angry hornets.
Fire in that left hand. There's a right hand. That's going to go in. This mentally and physically in this round, though, by hanging in there. Oh. We're about to go down for another third time here now in the fifth round.
Jennings goes down for the third time tonight.
Cotto's jab was arguably his best weapon. It was not only powerful, but varied and precise. He was great at mixing up different kinds of jabs, using them to unsettle a fighter's balance and rhythm. It prevented them from getting any real offense going when Cotto was on the back foot, and helped him press forward when he was looking to be more offensive. Cotto could jab from multiple ranges, from a distance or close up. He could alternate to the head and body, mixing offbeat rhythms with feints and throwaway punches. A throwaway jab is a fake-out jab that is still almost fully extended, but has no commitment behind it. It's a great tool, and one of the main advantages is in baiting out a defensive reaction from the opponent. Here Cotto's throwaway jab causes the opponent to shell up and duck, so Cotto takes advantage of the new guard shape with an uppercut. Another classic that Cotto loved to use was the double jab. The second jab could be used to take advantage of the defensive reaction from the first. Or, if they tried to counter after the first jab, the second jab could stop that idea. I have said the word jab so many times now. Did you guys know I had a video on 50 ways to throw a jab? That's actually not a joke. It's linked in the description. Against southpaws like Martinez and Judah, Cotto used his jab to jam the opponent's jab and set up his left hook, basically as a way to brute force hand fighting. Since the lead hand and shoulder of opposite foot fighters tend to get in the way of each other, many fighters try to wrestle to create openings for punches. But Cotto was more wont to just try and blast his way through. Cotto used boxing to mark up and abuse opponents' defenses until their guards were thrown into disrepair, like once prime real estate now turned into a derelict drug den. Eventually, it was time to set the charges and demolish their defense. This is when Cotto would swarm, throwing rapid-fire combinations that were designed to overwhelm his competition. One punch was used to incentivize them to alter their guard, clearing way for the next punch. Here a head punch gets the opponent thinking high, so he raises his guard to block Cotto's follow-up, but Cotto's glove bites into his liver instead. This can be called guard shaping, and you could think of it as how a general likes to shape a battlefield to make it easier to attack the enemy. Cotto's best tactic for this was to double up on left hooks, alternating the head and body. He would generate extra power by sinking low, then standing back up into the punch, his low-line defense setting up how he drove into the strike with his legs. Alternating the hook and uppercut was another effective shaping tactic. But it was the way that Cotto only occasionally threw a right hand that seemed to disorient opponents the most. as most fighters expect a left-right combination. Instead, Cotto liked to throw left-left-right. And he repeated this until they collapsed to the canvas. If you're looking to utilize Cotto's style, there are a few things to keep aware of. It's really worth it to look at his loss to Manny Pacquiao, first off, to see how he did so well at the start of the fight, which goes back to a lot of what we've already covered. But secondly, to examine how he was ultimately defeated. In the end, he was unable to keep up with Pacquiao because of one crucial reason. Pacquiao could move while exchanging, and Cotto liked to sink down and stay put while flurrying. So a way to more smoothly transition from mobile boxing to swarming might be a good idea. Cotto also had a hard time blocking right hands from a high guard. He was much better while shoulder rolling, but this is more of a Philly shell tactic, and it doesn't lend itself well to throwing combinations. These issues aside, Cotto's style is tailor-made for those who like to box, but also like to throw down.
It's hard to think of a more perfect boxer-puncher than the legendary Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Hearns was a masterclass in using beautiful boxing to set up tremendous power shots. He used his signature flicker jabs and chopping right crosses to climb his way through 5 championships in 5 different weight classes. These techniques were so unique, they were even referenced in the popular boxing anime Hajime no Ippo. Many credit Hearns' successes to his lengthy frame, but it's far more accurate to say that Hearns knew how to use his natural advantages to their fullest. You would be hard-pressed to find a better template for an aspiring tall, lengthy fighter than the Hitman. So today, let's look at all the incredible techniques and tactics that came out of Hearns' unique style, and examine exactly how and why they worked so well for the Hitman. Hearns began his career as a stylist, using footwork and timing to set up his lightning-fast jab. Much like his hero, Muhammad Ali, Hearns would use a cross step to circle to the inside, throwing out his jab elbow first. Yet another trait that Hearns borrowed from Ali was keeping his lead hand low. Keeping a low front hand is basically asking for a punch to the face, and leading with your elbow, as Hearns did, is normally nothing more than a great way to announce to your competitor that your punch is coming. But something truly amazing about Hearns is that he turned both principles on their head, as demonstrated by the sheer number of successfully connected jabs followed by power shots. In fact, his low lead hand often enticed opponents to headhunt, drawing out punches that Hearns could then slip and counter. One benefit of keeping his lead hand low was that it allowed Hearns to punch upwards, raising his hand through the small space in his opponent's guard. And this created a number of great opportunities to confuse his opponents, since the initiation of the movement for his jab was the exact same as the start of Hearns' body jabs and lead hooks. So Hearns' opponents couldn't be sure whether to expect a jab, a hook, or a body shot, as Hearns could change his strike mid-motion between all 3. Or Hearns could simply feint to trick his opponents into expecting one punch, only to immediately land with another. And there were a few preparatory motions that Hearns was fond of that really helped him sell these deceptions. Hearns constantly pumped his lead hand, building anticipation for the punch in order to dull his opponent's reflexes for when the real punch came. At times, he would even sway his lead hand back and forth like a scythe before blending that motion into a punch. Hearns was also a big fan of the double jab or even triple jab. He used the first jab to gauge an opponent's reaction, and the second or third jab then capitalized on the openings that reaction had created. In fact, Hearns' low guard and punch variety could allow him to dominate fights with just a few punches from his lead hand alone. But as Hearns developed over time into a legendary knockout artist, his flicker jab evolved into a powerful tool to set up his insane right cross. When opponents got their heads snapped back by one of Hearns' powerful jabs, they could expect Hearns' chopping right to follow shortly after. Competitors who attempted to parry or catch Hearns' rising jabs realized too late that they had just created an opening for one of the greatest rear hands in boxing history. Part of the reason Hearns was able to land his power right so effectively was that he had already gauged his opponent's distance with his jabs, using his arm as a yardstick to determine range and position. This tactic is especially helpful for taller fighters with a longer reach, as it can be difficult to keep track of the shorter fighter's head movement with sight alone. Aside from measuring distance, Hearns would also leave his arm extended to frame off of his opponents. In addition to keeping an opponent safely at length, framing also allowed Hearns to manipulate his opponent's head or shoulders, redirecting their momentum at worst and throwing them completely off balance at best. Transitioning between frames and collar ties, Hearns would force his opponents to make the terrible choice between stumbling around blindly or losing their balance completely. This same tactic was used very effectively by George Foreman when he took the championship from Joe Frazier. Another major advantage was that Hearns could easily use his footwork to reposition himself while maintaining that constant arm's length shield between himself and his opponent. And the same way that Muay Thai practitioners use this long guard to establish angles for their roundhouse kicks, Hearns could also steer his opponents while transitioning himself to an advantageous angle to land his power shots. This strategy afforded Hearns even more control of his opponent's movements, draining away their energy as he piled up points. While the tactics described so far could have been developed by Hearns intuitively through years of hard work and experience, the way that he completely dismantled an opponent's defenses through carefully crafted combinations shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that Hearns possessed a terrific ring IQ. When people think of fighters who excelled at destroying their opponent's guard, they most likely think of shorter, stockier boxers like Mike Tyson, or kickboxers like Gokhan Saki, a fighter who uses footwork and head movement to get in close before tearing apart their opponent's guard with angling hooks and uppercuts. And this does work really well for shorter fighters with shorter arms. But for a lengthier, long-range fighter like Hearns, this approach had to be drastically modified. Whereas Tyson might have thrown a body hook directly into a head hook, Hearns was too far away to do this without telegraphing his intentions, especially if he was hoping to double up with his rear hand. So, Hearns simply, but brilliantly, put a jab in between all of his rear hand power shots. By inserting flicker jabs into his guard-destroying combinations, Hearns occupied the opponent's time with a throwaway punch while still alternating between high and low power punches. So while Tyson could throw right body hook, right head hook from close range, Hearns could throw jab right body hook to jab right head hook from long range. The result was the same. An opponent clearing their own guard out of the way in anticipation of a low punch that instead went high. Because of Hearns' dense punch vocabulary, he could at times get away with simply blasting out a right. It's ironic that sometimes complex, nuanced setups can allow a fighter to get away with blazingly blatant attacks. And it's not like opponents weren't looking for it, as most of Hearns' fights ended via his terrifying chopping right. Sometimes called a roundhouse right or vertical hook, Hearns' chopping right was an odd mix of more traditional punches. It came from underneath and to the side, then snapped over, with Hearns' elbow often turning towards the ceiling at the end of the movement.
While at first glance it seems like a punch that could be easily defended, it actually put Hearns' opponents in a pretty tough spot. Not only was it difficult to notice it coming from underneath and around their guard, but the atypical path of Hearns' right allowed him to navigate through the cracks in his opponent's defenses. He could also cross over their jab and around their lead shoulder. Or follow the path of their head movement if they tried to duck away. In this scenario, Hearns would often miss with his glove, but still land with the palm of his hand or even his forearm, and the effect was still a nightmare for his competitors. For those looking to add Hearns' chopping right to their own toolkit, pay attention in particular to how Hearns would use his footwork to complement his cross. Hearns would step forward into his cross. This generated more momentum and helped to close the distance for follow-up shots. In fact, stepping into a more neutral stance put Hearns in a prime position to follow up with a lead hook. And Hearns threw this shot very well to the head or the body. But believe it or not, Hearns' chopping right wasn't always enough on its own to get the job done. And that is why one of the things that really stands out when looking at Hearns' career was the sheer number of TKOs that he amassed alongside his one-punch KOs. Hearns knew that, even as a fighter who boxed best at a distance, there would be times where he would need to get in close and swarm his competitor. This would usually present some problems for a taller fighter, as they could easily get tied up or have their lengthier arms stifled at close range. But Hearns had a number of strategies to work around this problem. Since Hearns couldn't take advantage of tight, controlled punches like Mike Tyson or Roberto Duran, he would instead loop and arc his punches when at close range. This not only allowed him to get full extension, but also let him take advantage of the limited space to still generate power. This did cut down on his speed a bit, as his punches needed to travel wider arcs to cover the same distance. But Hearns could create more space to punch by shuffling laterally, giving himself room to extend his arms. This tactic worked very well against opponents who tried to aggressively move forward in an attempt to overwhelm Hearns at close range or enter into the clinch. Hearns could then move back and sideways, stepping out of the line of danger while at the same time countering with his own punches. In fact, Hearns could essentially invite opponents to walk directly into one of his hard shots. There are few fighters with as much to teach the next generation as Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Whether you're a taller fighter looking to take advantage of your reach, or a shorter fighter who wants to understand the worst of the things you might face in the ring, Hearns should definitely be used as a reference in your training curriculum.
Sonny Liston was a complete monster in the ring. It's hard to think of a more intimidating, more feared champion. Liston's fists were bigger than most men's biceps. He had an 84-inch reach and strengthened his neck by standing on his head for hours on end. More importantly, Liston also had the brains to put these physical advantages to good use. Setting up his power shots with one of the best jabs in boxing history. But most overlooked Liston's jab, as the punches it set up tended to leave a much bigger impression. Today, we'll take a look at the largely unrecognized sophistication behind Liston's savagery. And then close off the video by examining how he dismantled the great Floyd Patterson, taking the heavyweight championship in the very first round. To start with, Liston's footwork was unusual. He moved back foot to front, the opposite of most boxers.
This method did limit Liston's mobility to some extent, making it harder for him to suddenly change directions. However, it was this movement dynamic that was a big part in enhancing the power and reach of Liston's jab. While many fighters step into their jab to cover distance and add power, stepping was just the very start for Liston, a way to put his weight into motion before adding even more momentum by shuffling into his punch. Liston didn't lift his back foot off the ground for mobility like Ali, or leap into his jab to cut off the ring like Hagler. Instead, he tended to keep his front foot firmly planted on the ground, his back foot dragging behind. This allowed his weight to fall over his front foot into his opponent, his fist connecting halfway through his shuffle. This movement pattern of step and shuffle is usually reserved for power shots, but Liston's jab pretty much was a power shot. An added benefit was that the shuffle allowed him to propel himself into follow-up rights. But Liston's jab was more than just powerful. It was also an invaluable tool that granted him total control of the ring. Liston liked to paw forward with his jab, more like a hammer fist, loading up as he stepped and swatting down as he shuffled. And rather than snap his jab and pull it back, he many times preferred to leave it extended well past the point of impact, essentially leaning into his opponent. To be very clear, this does not mean that Liston's jab was a push. What it does mean is that it sometimes turned into a push after the initial moment of impact. This worked to unbalance opponents and force them to bear some of his weight. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond this, Liston would use his jab for guard manipulation, even pulling down opponents' guards to make way for follow-up punches. This same tactic is a big reason why Deontay Wilder has landed so many knockout crosses. And it worked just as well back then as it does today. But more often than not, Liston preferred to use his extended jab to control an opponent's head or shoulders. This worked both defensively and offensively. Defensively, Liston could stiff-arm his opponent to stop them from closing distance. Offensively, Liston could steer opponents away from the center of the ring and into the ropes, making it much easier to cut off the ring. Or he could even create advantageous angles, turning opponents into his punches. Liston also modified this technique to safely close distance, transitioning his extended jab into a forearm frame to lock his opponent's guard. Just imagine for a second that Sonny Liston is at close range and you can't move your arms. Not a fun place to be. This was especially useful for setting up body shots. Body shots were a favorite of Liston's anyways, who threw them about as often as the rest of his power shots. If nothing else, they were another great tool for cutting off the ring. The tactics that Liston employed with his jabs really ran through the entirety of his style. For instance, Liston leaned into his missed hooks as well, knocking opponents around with his forearms. As I said in my last breakdown of Overeem, a big difference between a novice and a master is that the master will use one technique to set up another, even if the first technique fails. To this effect, Liston also used missed power punches to frame off opponents. Turning a missed punch into a frame is a very common tactic, but Liston used it in a highly uncommon and highly devastating way. While many fighters will sadly use missed punches to set up the clinch and halt the action, Liston used them to deny opponents' head slots in order to paralyze them, trapping them in place. The same way that some fighters can place their feet in certain positions next to an opponent's feet to cut off the ring and deny them angles, Liston could place his punches in certain spots that denied his opponent's head movement, At times, his frames would force opponents to bear his weight as Liston lined up his next shot. At other times, he would use these frames to block an opponent's vision, hiding his follow-up blow. Now let's look at how all of these tactics worked together against heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson, culminating in one of the most dominant title fights of all time. Patterson practiced the same peekaboo boxing that Tyson would later use to become the youngest heavyweight champion of all time, employing head movement from a squared-up stance to get close and fire off tight hooks from all angles. But unlike Tyson, Patterson preferred to bend at the waist. So Liston's guard manipulations were kryptonite against Patterson's head movement tactics. And this was apparent immediately. Liston shut down Patterson and froze him in place when he tried to move in. He did this by turning his jabs, hooks, and crosses into frames, denying Patterson the ability to punch out of his weaves. Liston then targeted Patterson's sides as he was trapped in his crouch. Since Patterson loved to get close by weaving underneath his opponent's jabs, Liston used his extended jabs to track his head, denying him entry and maintaining positional awareness at all times. 1 minute into the fight, Liston denied Patterson a clean exit out of an exchange by blocking with his forearm, and then landed a tight, jarring uppercut to Patterson's chin. Patterson was already in trouble, and Liston began landing shots at will, using his first punch to frame and turn Patterson into his second punch. Patterson tried to clinch, but Liston used the position of his forearm on Patterson's shoulder to move him around, slamming left after left into Patterson's chin. Liston disengaged to get some space, then piled on, dropping Patterson and taking the championship in under 2 minutes. It's easy to see how much a young George Foreman learned from Sonny Liston as his longtime sparring partner. And Foreman's dismantling of Frazier, another champion who loved to crouch, is eerily similar. While overshadowed by many great boxers that came before and after, no one can deny the savage sophistication of Sonny Liston. A lot of the footage from this breakdown was from the channel Boxing's Greatest Fighters in full color, so check out that channel to see a lot of old fights colorized for the first time ever. I've left a link in the description. You can check out my books on power, defense, and footwork if you're looking to learn the techniques shown in this video. From the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training. Ricardo Lopez has a 51-0 record with a 75% knockout rate. And while that would be very impressive for a heavyweight, Foreman has about an 85% knockout rate, for example. Lopez pulled this off while weighing close to 100 pounds. But Lopez was no mere knockout artist. In fact, it was a major upset if he happened to lose a few rounds in an otherwise flawless fight. His style even inspired the character of Ricardo Martinez in the phenomenal boxing anime Hajime no Ippo. And don't worry, we'll be taking a look at a few elements that the show happened to get spot on. Whether you're talking about the real-life Lopez or his anime counterpart, watching Lopez in the ring is to watch a true master of his craft. A master who happened to be amazing at every single aspect of boxing. Put simply, the man had no weaknesses. Imagine facing Lopez, working your hardest to close the distance. When he keeps evading your attacks and punishing you from the outside, you get dirty, rabbit punching, headbutting, and punching to the groin. Then, after rounds and rounds of trying to get inside, you finally get your wish, only to discover once you're at your preferred range that he's better than you there too. One of the main points made about Lopez's anime counterpart is his non-telegraphic jab. It's referred to in the series as the ghost jab, because opponents are rarely able to see it coming. The series gets this fairly accurate, as Lopez did indeed shoot his jab out very straight, keeping his fist vertical and only turning it over at the very last second. This helped him to split his opponent's guard,
just as Pacquiao does today. But of course, there's much more to Lopez's ability to dominate the ring with his jab alone. To understand Lopez's style is to understand movement itself, and the subtle balance between offense and defense. Which is why we'll begin the breakdown with the most fundamental pattern used by boxers for both offense and defense, the circle and jab. In boxing, most fighters choose to keep their front foot aligned with that of their opponents. This blocks their adversary's punches by placing their lead arm and shoulder in the way. In order to jab, one fighter must step slightly inside. This gives their jab a chance to land by realigning it past their opponent's lead arm and shoulder. But this same step usually alerts opponents to the fact that a jab might be coming. However, Lopez had a way to not only disguise this step, but improve its distance. Lopez prepared his jab by crouching and lunging forward, loading most of his weight onto his lead foot. The sudden weight shift onto his lead leg built momentum, and allowed Lopez the ability to suddenly explode forward by lifting his lead leg and propelling himself off of his back foot. If you slow down the footage, you'll notice that Lopez's opponents do notice his jabs, and even react defensively. What they're not prepared for is the distance that Lopez is able to cover, and the power with which he connects. If you're looking for a clear example of Dempsey's drop step, you can't find a much better example than Lopez. This sudden crouch and lunge should have made Lopez's jabs more telegraphic, but Lopez constantly bobbed forward, masking his offense by setting it up with defensive head movement. We'll examine how Lopez built his offense off of this crouch and drop step in the second half of this video, because, like Muhammad Ali, Lopez wore his opponents down with beautiful boxing before going in for the finish, tagging them and then skillfully moving out of the way. At this early stage of the fight, Lopez relied on defensive jabs and counters. He would outmaneuver his competitors using complex timing and footwork. We'll start with Lopez's simplest footwork technique, his masterful use of pivots, and then build up to more complex footwork from there. Pivoting works incredibly well for intercepting an opponent's punches, and because of this, Lopez often used them to exit exchanges and regain the center of the ring. This method also made it easier for Lopez to double up on his lead hand. The first step would load one punch with power, and then his pivot would load the next. Fighters usually pair this technique with the shoulder roll, but Lopez used it offensively to counter hooks or uppercuts. This worked particularly well against southpaws. Because his opponents had their opposite foot forward in a southpaw stance, Lopez could pivot out to sneak his uppercut underneath their jab, where they couldn't see it coming. Next up, let's look at how Lopez switched stances as he exited exchanges and escaped corners. Switching stances allowed him to move faster, as it's always easier to move laterally in the direction of your back foot. Stepping so far to the side that you change which foot is in front is known as a lateral shift, and was a favorite of Mike Tyson. However, Lopez would laterally shift more like Willie Pep, usually employing a C-step by sliding his lead foot back as if he were shuffling, and then stepping it out to the inside. This tactic came with an added benefit against southpaws. It closed off his stance by putting his lead shoulder in the way of the southpaw left hand. Also like Pep, Lopez liked to escape the ropes by darting out in one direction before short stopping and then rebounding the other way. He usually added a weave to this, which allowed him to rapidly shift his momentum from one direction to another by using the rotation of his upper body to shift his weight from one foot to the other. So Lopez was great at evading exchanges, but what happened when he got cornered? We've already mentioned pivots, but Lopez would sometimes take his pivots a step further by using them to create extreme angles, sometimes even shifting stances as he did so. For instance, here Lopez weaves under a rear hand to pivot out to the center of the ring, changing his opponent into a southpaw stance by pivoting all the way behind him. This is a novel version of a linear shift, sometimes called a D'Amato shift. A linear shift is when a fighter moves so far past his opponent, it changes both of their stances, as we see Tyson do here. He and his partner both begin in an orthodox stance with their left foot forward, and then both end up in a southpaw stance with their right foot forward. But since Lopez pivoted rather than shuffled, he remained in an orthodox position, while only his opponent was put into a southpaw stance. As such, this would be a great tactic for those who have amazing footwork, but who are only comfortable in one stance. Lopez did the same thing in reverse against southpaws, pivoting inside to switch both fighters to an orthodox stance. Once again, this maintained his preferred stance, while putting his opponent into a stance that they were not used to. Lopez would sometimes pivot to the outside against an orthodox fighter as well, coming up behind them and spinning them around by hooking their hip. However, Lopez didn't always need fancy footwork to switch stances. Sometimes, he let the opponent do the work for him. He would simply stay put and turn as they hurled past him so that he could catch them from his new stance. This is known as a turn shift. All of these footwork patterns were highly impressive, but they came at a price. They required Lopez to keep a short, narrow stance that was often incompatible with throwing powerful punches and combinations. This is one of the fundamental problems with fighters who want high mobility, which favors a high, short stance, and punching power, which favors a lower, lengthier stance. However, Lopez had a few brilliant ways to seamlessly transition between both stances. If Lopez planned to enter, he would sneak his back foot out to lengthen his stance, masking it behind his crouch. A more dynamic method was to combine his drop step with what is known in some sports as a split step. As he dropped down to build momentum, Lopez would jump both feet off the ground to widen his stance, and then push off of his back foot. This technique is common in wrestling, and could fluidly transition Lopez from using an agile footwork-based mobility stance to a wide power-based stance. Lastly, Lopez would sometimes act as if he were going to take a small step forward, and then skip off of his back foot instead. This technique is far more often used to set up kicks in Muay Thai or kickboxing, but Lopez was athletic enough to pull it off with punches. As Lopez became more aggressive in the later rounds, he would stop throwing so many jabs, and instead use the aforementioned footwork tricks to throw crosses or overhands, or load up on lead hooks. In his wider stance, Lopez relied on head movement rather than footwork to keep him safe, leaving underneath punches in a deep crouch to return counters. Lopez was looking for lengthy exchanges that presented him with lots of opportunities to land. At this stage of the fight, Lopez didn't necessarily care if he took a few shots along the way. There were even times when Lopez, having lost all respect for his opponent, took shots on purpose just to get in position to throw harder shots of his own. In this clip, Lopez only bothers to move out of the way for one shot he considers particularly threatening, taking the time to load up a huge power blow. If Lopez did look to exit, suddenly straightening up from his crouch provided the backwards momentum he needed to quickly retreat. It's worth mentioning that we've observed Lopez using his head movement to prepare his footwork in every direction now. Other than drop step, Lopez would also lead with his right to step in deep with his back foot, squaring himself up to an opponent and using lateral movement to create new angles. Or he could just step forward enough to shift all the way into southpaw. Lopez often paired these steps with the doubling up on his right. The second right made it easier off of Lopez's squared up stance. We'll end the breakdown with something else Ipo got spot on: Lopez's ability to track head movement. While Lopez's quick reflexes did allow him to easily intercept his opponent's head movement, he also excelled at putting together combinations that led opponents into punches. In other words, one punch would elicit a reaction that set up the next.